Did you know that one of the greatest victories in the Bible was led by a woman? In the midst of a generation marked by idolatry, oppression, and fear, God raised up someone unlikely to change the history of Israel. A woman sitting under a palm tree, but leading a nation with a prophetic voice and spiritual authority. Her name was Deborah, a prophetess, judge, and leader in times when chaos reigned and faith seemed forgotten. This video will reveal to you why Deborah knew what many did not, that victory belongs to those who fully trust in God's intervention. If you've ever felt too small, too untrustworthy, or too incapable of fighting forces greater than yourself, this story is for you. Because Deborah didn't lead with a sword, but with wisdom. She didn't command armies by her own strength, but by divine direction. And when everyone was waiting for a hero, God used a woman to fulfill a plan of redemption with courage, obedience, and unwavering faith. Prepare to discover hidden truths in the book of Judges, revelations that show how God can transform silent leaders into instruments of deliverance. We'll explore the details of this powerful narrative, from the calling of Deborah to the fall of the fearsome commander Sisera, including moments of pure divine strategy, an unexpected miracle, and a song that echoes to this day as a testimony to the glory of God. Deborah didn't just judge cases, she judged destinies. And alongside Barak, and with the boldness of Jael, she starred in one of the most remarkable chapters of the Old Testament. But what made her so different? And how can her story change the way you see your own spiritual mission? If you are looking for real inspiration, true courage, and want to understand how faith can defeat 900 iron chariots, literally, stay with me until the end. This is not just another video, it is an invitation to understand how God works through those who are willing to listen to Him and act. Have you ever stopped to think about what it would be like to be led by a woman in the Old Testament? Well, that's exactly what happened in Israel. Deborah was not only a prophetess, she was also a judge of Israel, a woman of faith who occupied the role of spiritual leadership in chaotic times. Sitting under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, she listened to the people, advised, judged, and guided them. And most impressively, all of this with wisdom, feminine courage, and deep intimacy with God. Deborah was the voice of God in the midst of confusion. In times when idolatry was rampant and people were forgetting the Lord, Deborah stood firm. She saw what many did not see, not with natural eyes, but with spiritual discernment. She was a woman who did not remain silent in the face of injustice and did not back down in the face of oppression. Being a prophetess was not a status, it was a mission. And being a judge of Israel then, a calling that she fulfilled with honor, even knowing that she was in a very rare position for a woman. This only proves that when God calls, He enables. Deborah's life shows that spiritual leadership has nothing to do with gender, but with obedience. She did not lead alone. She listened to God's voice before giving any direction. And that is exactly how one of the most incredible stories in the book of Judges began, with a woman who knew how to listen and knew how to act. What many today would call impossible, she faced with faith. Her story is a miracle in the form of leadership, and this teaches us that God still raises Deborahs in the world. The most inspiring thing is to see how her influence transformed the people. Deborah was like a beacon in the midst of darkness, firm, stable, and full of light. She was the bridge between the cry of Israel and the divine response. Nothing escaped her gaze, not even the suffering of those who were being crushed by the Canaanite army. With Barak, she would form an unexpected partnership. But before that, she was the one who sustained the faith of a nation. A woman of prayer, yes, but also of action. Don't think it was easy. In a culture where men dominated public spaces, Deborah had to prove her worth without raising her voice, only with results. And there is no clearer result than the liberation of an entire people. Her stance taught about feminine courage, yes, but also about the power of God's intervention when leadership is aligned with heaven. Her presence was prophetic, and her mission was clear, to lead Israel to redemption, and she did it masterfully. The introduction to Deborah's story is a true lesson on how God chooses who he wants. A woman guided by faith and marked by a sense of justice that came from above. His story challenges us to be leaders too, not by position, but by purpose. And the question remains, are we listening to God with the same sensitivity as her, or do we continue to wait for others to do what was entrusted to us? After the death of Judge Ehud, the people of Israel once again strayed from the path of the Lord. As if he had learned nothing from previous cycles, he plunged into idolatry, worshipping strange gods and moving away from the covenant. The consequence was not long in coming. God allowed them to be delivered into the hands of a cruel enemy, King Jabin, also known as Javim, a Canaanite ruler feared for his military strength. Their commander was Sisera, a fierce strategist who commanded a true nightmare on wheels, 900 iron chariots. Israel was in shock, overwhelmed and afraid. For 20 years, the Israelites lived under severe oppression. The roads became dangerous, the villages emptied, and hope seemed scarce. The Canaanite army dominated not only with physical force, but with psychological intimidation. Each iron chariot of Sisera was like a metallic reminder that freedom had been lost. The once proud people now lived in hiding, cornered, waiting for a miracle. And it is at this point in the story that we see the pattern. When idolatry enters, oppression soon follows. But oppression has a curious way of forging faith, even through pain. The people began to cry out. It was no longer a routine prayer, but a desperate cry coming from the depths of his being. They knew that only God's intervention could break that structure of fear and power. And it is exactly when Israel cries out sincerely that history changes. It was like that before. It would be like that again. The cycle repeats itself. Sin, punishment, outcry, redemption. This part of the biblical narrative teaches us that idolatry always exacts a high price. When we place our trust in anything outside of God, we open the door for external forces to dominate our inner selves. The story of King Jabin and Sisera shows that the strength of the enemy grows as the faith of the people weakens. It is a warning to all of us. Distancing ourselves from God does not only lead to spiritual weakness, it opens the way for emotional, mental, and even physical slavery. Imagine living under the constant shadow of an overwhelming army, knowing that your only defense is gone. That was the scenario in which Deborah was raised up. The oppression was not just military, it was spiritual as well. And in the midst of this dark valley, God began to light a flame of deliverance. This shows us that no matter how hopeless the situation may seem, God is never idle. He was already preparing an answer. And, surprisingly, that answer would come through a woman. If you feel trapped in a season of oppression, no matter what it may be, remember, sincere cries still move heaven. It is not the time of suffering that determines victory, but the moment we decide to turn our eyes to the Lord. It was at this point in history that Israel saw once again that deliverance does not come from horses, chariots, or armies, but from the Lord of hosts, and the divine plan was about to be revealed. In the midst of chaos, God doesn't just answer the cry, He raises up leaders, and that's exactly what happened with Deborah. More than a prophetess, she became the balance point for the entire nation. Beneath the palm tree, she judged cases, but she also restored hearts. What seemed like just a woman offering advice was actually a direct line to heaven. Israel needed not just a strategist, but someone who heard God clearly and obeyed courageously. Her spiritual leadership was not based on physical strength, but on divine authority. She was the bridge between the people and God, and she was taken seriously for it. At a time when women were undervalued, Deborah was honored as Israel's judge. This shows that God breaks human protocols to establish his eternal purposes. She proved day after day that true leadership does not shout but guides, and her influence did not come from a throne but from intimacy with the Lord. It was in this environment of authority and faith that Deborah received a powerful prophetic word. God wanted to act, and he needed someone to obey. The message was clear. Barak was to gather 10,000 men and climb Mount Tabor because the Lord would deliver Sisera into their hands. But look how interesting. The one who carries the vision is Deborah, not Barak. This shows us how God trusts those who walk with him constantly. The prophetess became the spokesperson for a spiritual and physical war. Barak's reaction reveals a lot about his vision and dependence. He said, "I will go, but only if you go with me." Does that sound like cowardice? Maybe, but it could also be interpreted as respect for God's presence in Deborah's life. He knew this was not just a battle between armies, but between spiritual kingdoms, and Deborah was like the Ark of the Covenant walking in the flesh. He didn't want to go without prophetic covering, and that changes everything. Deborah accepted the challenge, but she made a prophecy that would become history. The glory of victory will not be yours, Barak, but a woman's. It was as if she could see the end of the script even before the first scene. Her spiritual sensitivity was accompanied by firmness. She was not intimidated. She did not hesitate. This is leadership with prophetic vision. And if you have ever felt that you are being called to something great, but doubt your position, remember Deborah. She did not ask to be a leader, but she answered the call. Deborah's leadership is an invitation to reflect on our own attitude. Are we listening to God's voice or waiting for others to hear it for us? Have we obeyed promptly, or are we resisting the call out of fear, doubt, or convenience? History is about to accelerate towards an epic battle, but it all begins here, with a woman of faith saying yes to God's calling. And when someone obeys, heaven moves. There is no victory without strategy, and God is the greatest strategist of all time. When Deborah received the divine command, she did not sit around waiting for a miracle to fall from the sky. She stood up with courage and went to Barak with a plan. Gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and climb Mount Tabor. The detail here is important. The mountain represented a vantage point. It was spiritual and tactical height. While the enemy trusted in his 900 iron chariots, Israel placed itself under God's direction. The order was not just a suggestion, it was a heavenly command. The Canaanite army was stronger, more numerous, and better resourced. But Deborah knew that when God enters the equation, numbers lose their power. She made it clear to Barak that victory was assured, but it depended on obedience. It is true today, many divine promises are just waiting for someone to say yes in a practical way. Climbing Mount Tabor was more than a military move. It was an act of faith. Barak listened, hesitated, and then responded with one condition: "I will only go if you go with me." Many people criticize this stance, but it also reveals something profound. He recognized that Deborah was an extension of God's presence. This alone shows the level of respect and spiritual discernment that existed in her. But Deborah, without hesitation, accepted, not because she wanted the glory of war, but because she knew that God was leading her to something greater. And so, yet another prophecy: the victory would not belong to a man. This point in the plan is crucial. Deborah prophesied that the honor for defeating Sisera would not go to Barak, but to a woman. How bold! It was as if she were announcing that the logic of the world would be broken once again. The Canaanite army, with all its pomp, would be defeated by invisible strategies, unshakable faith, and an unexpected weapon. This is God's way, to act in ways that confound the wise and humble the mighty. The battle plan was more spiritual than military. It's important to note that Deborah doesn't replace Barak, she activates him. This teaches us that spiritual leadership is often about leading others into your purpose. She didn't have to be on the battlefield, but she chose to be. This is feminine courage in action. This is a woman of faith saying, "I am with you," because she fully trusts in God's intervention. Her presence there was not symbolic, it was strategic, not to wield a sword, but to sustain the prophetic environment. If you are facing a battle and don't know where to start, ask yourself, what is the plan that God has already revealed to you? Perhaps Mount Tabor is before you, and fear is holding you back. But remember, obedience is the trigger for miracles. God's plan may seem illogical, but it is always perfect. And now that everything is in motion, the stage for battle is set, and heaven is about to intervene in a supernatural way. The army of Israel, led by Barak and inspired by Deborah's faith, climbed Mount Tabor. From there, they had a wide view of the field and an even greater confidence in God's plan. Sisera, however, arrogantly brought his 900 iron chariots, symbols of military superiority, believing that victory would only be a matter of time. After all, he had the strength. What he didn't know was that God had already written the end of that story. And when God decides to intervene, even iron sinks. At the exact moment, Deborah gives the order, "Get up, for this is the day the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hands." It was the sign Barak was waiting for. He descended the mountain with his 10,000 men like an avalanche of faith. But what tipped the balance was not Israel's courage, but God's hand over nature. The river Kishon, which used to be calm, supernaturally overflowed. The wheels of the Canaanite chariots got stuck. It was the miracle in motion. With the iron chariots neutralized, the Canaanite army lost its advantage. Chaos broke out. The soldiers were left vulnerable, panic set in, and the Israelites took advantage of the opening. Sisera's army was utterly routed man by man. Not one escaped with his life, except the commander himself, who fled on foot. The irony here is divine. The man who had trusted in machines now ran unarmed and desperate. His strength dissolved like smoke before the glory of God. This epic battle was not won by human power, but by obedience and faith. While the Israelite army fought, there was a spiritual environment being governed by a prophetess. Deborah was not there as a spectator. She was the authority who declared victory before it manifested itself on the field. And that is what separates an ordinary war from a divine victory, the supernatural factor. When heaven decides to intervene, even the most perfect plans of the enemy fall apart. What do we learn here? That even the 900 iron chariots, symbols of Canaanite power, were no match for the God of Israel. This teaches us that no oppressive structure, no matter how well equipped it may seem, can withstand the voice of the Lord. Deborah's battle is a call to not trust appearances. What matters is who is on our side. And if God is on our side, victory is already certain. Even when all seems lost, there is still room for a miracle. The image of this battle is cinematic. Simple men descending from the mountain, soldiers fleeing in despair, and a river being an instrument of God himself. All of this under the spiritual leadership of a woman who dared to believe. Deborah's faith not only moved an army, but changed the history of a nation. And now, with Sisera on the run, the narrative takes an unexpected turn, because glory, as had been prophesied, was about to be handed over to another woman. As the battlefield still echoed with the cries of Canaanite defeat, Sisera ran. Exhausted, dirty, and desperate, the feared commander sought shelter. Then he saw a lonely tent in the middle of the road, that of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. They had a peace treaty with King Jabin, so Sisera thought he would be safe. Little did he know that this woman was part of God's plan. What seemed like a hiding place would be his final destination. Jael welcomed him with kindness, offering him milk instead of water and covering him with a cloth. She used hospitality as a strategy, not out of betrayal, but out of obedience to a greater purpose. While Sisera slept, tired and believing he was protected, Jael prepared for something unimaginable. She took a tent peg and with a sledgehammer drove it into the commander's temple. It was quick, precise, and final. The enemy who had terrorized Israel for 2 decades fell at the hands of a housewife. Here is fulfilled the prophecy of Deborah. The glory of victory will be given into the hands of a woman. It was not Deborah who killed Sisera, but she was the one who saw God's action first. And it was Jael, courageous and bold, who brought about the end of oppression. It is amazing how God uses the unlikely, a prophetess under a palm tree and a woman in her tent. Neither was a warrior, but both changed history. This shows us that faith and courage are more effective than any weapon. Jael had no army, no sword, no military status. She had discernment. She knew that this was the right time to act. Her act may seem shocking, but it is important to understand the context. She did not just eliminate a physical enemy, but she broke a spiritual structure of oppression, and she did it alone, in silence, without witnesses, but in complete alignment with heaven. This is what we call a miracle, disguised as human action. God uses those who are available, not necessarily those who are prepared. Jael's attitude invites us to step outside of our comfort zone. How many times have we thought we weren't the ideal person for something? Jael probably thought so too, but at that moment, she didn't consult her insecurities. She answered the call, and that's exactly what made her blessed among women. Her name was exalted in the Song of Deborah, recorded forever in the Book of Judges. She didn't make speeches, but her actions spoke loudly. It was the hammer blow that sealed Israel's victory. Jael's heroic act reminds us that courage can take unexpected forms. Sometimes it's not about getting on stage or commanding armies, but about doing what needs to be done when no one is watching. And now, with Sisera dead and the people free from oppression, the celebration was about to begin. Because when God gives victory, even the song becomes prophecy. With the death of Sisera, the air of fear that had hung over Israel was replaced by a new sound, the song of victory. Deborah and Barak, moved by gratitude and divine inspiration, sang a powerful hymn of praise recorded in chapter 5 of the Book of Judges. It was not just a song, but a sung prophecy, a poetic testimony to God's intervention, the faith of the people, and the courage of women. It was a living memorial. Every verse exuded the glory of God, extolled Jael, and denounced the vanity of their enemies. The song begins by praising the Lord for the willingness of the volunteers and the obedience of the people. This is beautiful, because the faith that moves mountains also moves hearts. And Deborah knew how to value this. She recognized that it was not just her leadership or Barak's strength, but the unity of the people with the divine purpose. Jael's name shines as a highlight. Blessed be she among women. Yes, the woman at the stake became a symbol of redemption. This shows that God never forgets the details of those he uses. One of the most impactful moments of the song is when Deborah describes the scene of Sisera's mother waiting for her son to return. The imagery is heartbreaking. She imagines her son bringing back spoils of war, when in fact he is already dead. This part reveals the futility of the enemy's hopes when God decides to act. It is a poetic and tragic touch, which shows the contrast between human expectations and spiritual reality. The message is clear. No one can thwart the Lord's plans. This song is more than a celebration. It is a legacy. It was written, preserved, and recited for generations. It is proof that God-inspired words endure through time. Deborah didn't want to sing just for the sake of singing. She wanted Israel to never forget what the Lord had done. And this is something we can learn from. We need to record our testimonies, share our victories, and keep the memory of miracles alive. Because faith feeds faith, and the memory of divine intervention strengthens us in difficult times. Furthermore, the song served as a spiritual re-education. After 20 years of oppression and idolatry, the people needed to turn their eyes to the true God. And what a powerful way to do this, through art, poetry, and music, tools that reach not only the mind, but the heart. This is Deborah's legacy, a leadership that transforms, a praise that teaches, a faith that spreads. Each word of the song is like a seal on the victory. It was not a human work, it was a miracle. The celebration led by Deborah was not the end, but a new beginning. It was the beginning of an era of peace, built on the courage of women and men who said yes to the divine calling. And perhaps by remembering this song, we will be challenged to write our own. What kind of legacy have we left? How have we celebrated God's action in our lives? Because every victory needs praise, and every praise needs to remember who the true victor was. Deborah's story is more than an inspiring story. It's a mirror in which we can see our own walk with God. How often do we feel like the people of Israel, overwhelmed by circumstances, suffocated by fears, and far from the presence of the Lord? But just as then, God still hears our sincere cries. He still raises up unlikely leaders, women and men of faith, to break cycles and lead others to freedom. The question is, are we listening to the call? Deborah teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, it is action even when fear is present. That leadership is not imposed but earned, that true authority comes from intimacy with God, not from titles, and that a woman filled with the Spirit can change destinies. She listened, obeyed, and acted. And this sequence is the secret to all transformation: listening with faith, walking with obedience, and acting with purpose. It doesn't matter if you are a man, a woman, young or old. God wants to use your life. And the most beautiful thing is that He doesn't need perfect heroes. He needs willing hearts. Barak with his doubts, Jael with her simple resources, and Deborah with her sensitive listening, they were all pieces of a greater plan. This shows that God's intervention does not depend on the strength of the arm, but on the surrender of the heart. Maybe you feel too small, but remember, 900 iron chariots could not stop the power of a God who responds to genuine faith. And that faith can be in your hands right now. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you is yearning for change. Maybe it's time to say yes to God, as Deborah said. To take charge of your spiritual leadership, restore your intimacy with the Lord, and allow Him to turn your battles into victories. Don't wait for perfect conditions. God uses what you have. He just needs a broken heart that's ready to obey. And the good news is that when you surrender, heaven moves on your behalf. So I invite you now to take a step of faith. Maybe it's time to reconcile with God, to let go of modern idols that have been stealing your focus. Maybe it's time to accept Jesus as your Savior and Lord, the one who transforms stories, restores identities, and gives purpose to those who feel lost. Just as He did with Deborah, He can use you to bring deliverance to many, not because you are strong, but because He is. So if this message touched your heart, say a sincere prayer. Ask God to raise up the Deborah that exists within you, man or woman, and teach you to listen, trust, and obey. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage of it right now. Turn on notifications, share this word with someone, and continue walking with us in stories that edify, inspire, and reveal the glory of God in the Bible and in your life.